everything in this world is relative. Everything we experience in this world is relative. The absolute things belong to God and belong to the world of God beyond this world. In this life, we see things in a relative term. For instance, you will find that, just give you an example, that when we say this room is cold, we mean that this room is really less warm than another room. But in relation to another room, this room may be still warm. Everything in life is relative. And we must look at it in this light. Now, in creation also, you will find that there are degrees of creation. Now, because some of us are new here and have not heard of the talk that was given the other day, perhaps I mention there are degrees in this creation. For example, we said the other day that there is the vegetable kingdom, the animal kingdom, the human kingdom, and that's as far as we can know. And then there is the manifestations of God. Let us see what we can do with this. First of all, you see, we were talking about this, the different degrees in existence, the different degrees, the different levels of existence, and that there was the vegetable, the animal, the human kingdom. And then there is the manifestations of God, and then there are so many other worlds of God which we are not aware of it in this life, that when we measure ourselves in relation to reality, we will find that we are very inadequate if we measure ourselves in relation to the world of reality. Now let us see how we can tackle this and see this question which is asked about humility. In one of the writings, Baha'u'llah has said that man should have in his heart the fear of God. And we often wonder, what does it mean? Is it that God is such a being that man should be frightened of him, to have a fear? And what does it mean that we have to have the fear of God? You will find that every creation which is, let us now talk of man actually. We'll find that man, in our daily lives, whenever we feel inadequate on any subject, we are not sure about ourselves in any subject, then naturally in our hearts we become fearful. That fear comes as a result of inadequacy. If you are absolutely confident about some subject or something, then you are not afraid. If you, for example, are facing with a young person who you are going to deal with him, he's a student and you are his teacher and you know your subject, there is no fear whatsoever. You are going to teach him and you are quite confident. But if somebody tells you now you must go and meet somebody outstanding today and he wants to meet you face to face and ask you so many questions about what you've done, if you feel inadequate, then you are afraid. Then the fear comes in there. And fear doesn't mean that one must be trembling, at least, to go and see a person. Even to a slightest extent, if man is not confident about himself, then there is an aspect of the fear. Now here is, I think, one relationship between God and man. And that relationship is the relationship of being inadequate as against God, in front of God. In relation to God, one feels his own inadequacy. And it is that which we must remember when we are thinking about ourselves. That have we done, in other words, have we lived the life which God has wanted us to live? Have we been carrying out the teachings of God in our own ways? Are we satisfied that we have done our work? If we have done this, then we have less fear. But when you look at ourselves, you'll find that if you really examine oneself, we will find ourselves always full of shortcomings. And as Abdul-Baha says, the more you progress spiritually, the more you will find that there are shortcomings within you. That there is no such a thing as a person who can say, oh, thanks be to God that I am now progressing spiritually. I'm so much progressing in the world of God. Look at me and look at the others. I have progressed and I am becoming closer to God. This means that one is falling down. This means that one is not progressing whatsoever towards God, that one is going backwards. And this aspect of one always measuring itself in relation to the world of reality brings in the aspect of inadequacy in man. If we measure ourselves in accordance, for example, with the world and the kingdoms below us, then we will feel perhaps great. If you measure yourself in accordance with, for example, the achievements of a person or peoples who are deprived of human qualities, and you find yourself much superior, then in that case we are falling short. We should always measure ourselves in accordance with the world of reality. And when we do that, we'll find we are absolutely falling short of those wonderful requirements that the teachings of God has, that there are in the teachings of Baha'u'llah and in the teachings of all the manifestations of God. It is then that we realize that how inadequate we can be. And it is this feeling of inadequacy which brings in humility. You see? The very fact, in the Western world, unfortunately, there is no such a thing as, I'm speaking now of the outside world, of inculcating in the human soul the idea of humility. Why should people be humble? On the contrary, every man tries his best in the outside world to make himself superior to others, to get up and do things so that everybody will notice him. And this personality comes out, the ego of man comes out, and this ego and personality which comes out causes great spiritual problems for the soul. Nevertheless, this is what man does. Every day of our lives, we will do this from the time that we get up in the morning to go to work until we come back. We find confronted with this situation of man seeking to dominate over others, and he has this ambition to become, to project his personality out. That's what it is. And in fact, we train our children from childhood to do this. I think we mentioned this at another stage. From the time that a child is born, we try to give him an importance, an aspect of importance to him. Now, I'm not trying to say that we must not attach importance to ourselves as far as the human soul is concerned, but as soon as it develops in a way that man develops an ego, then it will become bad. And as I was saying to you before, one evening, when I was a young boy, I did not know for a long time, and I did not care, and nobody even told me when my birthday was. You see? The very fact that we did not know when our birthday was. I've never heard anybody ever celebrating his birthday, because that creates personality, that creates an importance, that attaches an importance to a human being in relation to some other people. How can somebody ever come along into this room and say, look at me, I am today somebody, and I want you to notice me today because it's my birthday, therefore you all must revolve around me as a person and you must therefore bring all the presents for me. I must receive all the presents, and I'm going to sit in one place above you all, and you're all going to celebrate my birthday. You see, this attitude in the Islamic world, which I had come from, this background, has been completely alien to the spirit of submission which Muhammad and the teachings of Islam had inculcated in his people. That one should never talk about himself ever as I, and that one should only person who can indeed and who is worthy of being remembered is the manifestation of God. It is the birthday of the manifestation of God that you celebrate. It is for Him that you gather around and you bring all your love and your loyalty to Him. You see? And therefore the celebration of the birthday of the manifestation of God is the most important thing, because then you attach all the importance to Him and no importance to ourselves. Now, it is not right, it is not possible for one individual to try to say to other individuals, look, you all must become humble. It is far from it, because I also must share with you another thing. I also remember that when the early believers, some of the early believers that I had met when they were old, in my day, whenever you would ask them to speak on any subject, you could call them, for example, to get up and speak on a subject. They would not speak on any subject or in a manner which would imply that they are teaching you something. For example, I had never heard in those days that somebody stand up and say, we must now really be active, we must get up and serve the faith, or that we must get up and why don't you do this and why don't you do that, and this sort of thing. Anything which implies that one is instructing somebody else to do something in the way of spiritual progress, because that would amount to that would be very presumptuous. And on the contrary, I remember a person who, anytime you ask him to talk about the faith, about something in the faith, they would even give him a subject to talk. They would, for example, say, would you go and encourage the Baha'is to do this or to do that, because we need this. He would, on the contrary, he would stand up and talk about the manifestations of God and how to recognize them and things like this, far from anything to imply that a human being can have any aspect of superiority over somebody else. You see, this is a very important thing we must bear in mind. And Abdul-Baha is the example for us. You see, we say that Abdul-Baha is the exemplar of the faith. This is true. Abdul-Baha has, as I said in my talk some time ago, that Abdul-Baha has asked Baha'u'llah to be given the station of servitude. He has said that he wanted to become such a servant in the cause of God, towards mankind, such a servant that no other person could ever reach him as low as Abdul-Baha in servitude. And he says, when he asked Baha'u'llah, and he was a young boy then, he was a young boy, when he asked his father that he wanted to be given the station of servitude. And Abdul-Baha says that Baha'u'llah gave me this station of servitude. And he says that he prayed to Baha'u'llah that no one on this earth, no one ever could reach as low as Abdul-Baha in servitude, in reality. Now this servitude, which Abdul-Baha speaks, is the station of man. We were again talking about it, the three stations. You remember I was saying that there are three stations in the existence: the station of God, which we can never reach; the station of the prophets of God, which is again beyond us. We cannot reach them also, because they are chosen by God to manifest His qualities. They remain in their own world. Now Abdul-Baha says the only station which remains for man is that of servitude. And servitude is for man to attain to. Now as soon as one has ambition, this ambition becomes the greatest danger in his spiritual life, because ambition and servitude are opposite things. You cannot bring ambition and idea of servitude under one shelter, and the slightest amount of ambition would destroy the spirit of man. Ambition to become something. Unfortunately, you see what Baha'u'llah and what Abdul-Baha has said in his writing. He says, just to illustrate for you what Abdul-Baha meant by servitude, at one stage when he was in New York, the Baha'is had held a wonderful gathering there, and they asked if Abdul-Baha would take the chair, whether Abdul-Baha would become the chairman. And Abdul Baha said, me, the chairman? How can I be a chairman? I am the servant of the servants of God. How would you expect me to stand up and act as a chairman? You see, this was his attitude towards. And you know, at once it just came to me the story of some of the Persian friends may have heard and know the name. One of the wonderful teachers of the faith known as Janab al-Natiq. He was a man who was not relatively known to be an important. He was a teacher of the faith in Persia, but amongst all these important people we have in Persia as teachers of the faith, he was not of that caliber. But he was an outstanding in his own humility and service to the cause. And you know, Shoghi Effendi never appointed hands of the cause of God during his life, before 1951. He did not appoint anybody a hand of the cause of God during their lifetime. Some people were named hands of the cause when they died. After they died, Shoghi Effendi said that their rank was the rank of the hand of the cause. But he never appointed someone before 1951 to the rank of the hand of the cause when that person was alive. Now this may be strange to people who are not Baha'is. I'm just using a terminology which you do not understand. Some of you are not familiar with it. However, but in this case, he wrote a letter to this man telling him that your rank, your station, he did that in 1940s, early 1940s, he said your station is the station of the hand of the cause of God. Now this man never, in his humility, he never shared this message with anybody, even his wife and family. And we only learned of this when he died. And he died before Shoghi Effendi appointed other hands, before 1951. And when they searched his letters and his papers, they were amazed to find that Shoghi Effendi has conferred on him the rank of the hand of the cause of God. And this person, this shows the utmost degree of humility. And this is one aspect. Now, another thing, I'll give you some examples, some stories perhaps to illustrate to you this. Mirza Abu'l-Fadl was the greatest scholar we have had in the faith. And Abdul Baha has indeed shown, and Baha'u'llah himself has shown such a degree of love and attachment to Mirza Abu'l-Fadl that it is unparalleled in the whole history of the faith. You will find there have been martyrs in the faith, there have been hands of the cause in the faith, there have been great disciples of Baha'u'llah who were surrounding him, and stand above from all this figure, these wonderful people who have come into the faith, stand above them and away from them and distinct from them is Mirza Abu'l-Fadl. Now this Mirza Abu'l-Fadl, I want to tell you something about his life. How he became a Baha'i. Would you like to hear how he became a Baha'i? He was the head of a theological college in Tehran. There was no other man as distinguished as he was in his learning on matters of theology. And he became the head of this great college in Tehran, which is the College of Theology. And he was so much well known for his knowledge that some people used to refer to him as a living encyclopedia of knowledge. Later on, when he became a Baha'i in Egypt, they called him the god of literature and philosophy. And this was not said by ordinary people. This was the testimony of the great professors of the Al-Azhar University in Cairo, which is from the point of view of Arabic literature and Islamic literature, is the most outstanding university in the Muslim world. And they regarded him as the god of literature and philosophy, and some regarded his pen as again a symbol of great achievement in matters of eloquence and so forth. And Abdul Baha has referred to this man. Actually, his name Abu'l-Fadl means the father of all knowledge. This is a name that has been given to him, the father of all knowledge. And in one of his tablets, Abdul-Baha says, "O Abu'l-Fadl," means, "Oh, the father of all knowledge." And then he goes on to say, "and his brother, and his sister, and his mother." You see, this is how he describes him. In other words, he was everything. And yet this man, and Abdul-Baha also says in one of his writings, he says when Baha'u'llah passed away, 2 pens were inspired by his passing, at his passing. One was that of Abdul-Baha, and the other pen was that of Mirza Abu'l-Fadl. Now this man was such a great figure in our faith that I have seen, I have read perhaps all his life story and all the things that have been written about him, and he has left behind, of course, volumes in his writing, the faith. I'll tell you a little bit about his character. It's very interesting. And first, about his becoming a Baha'i. He was a Muslim theologian, a very well-respected person, and he, on a Friday afternoon, was riding on his donkey, going to the suburbs of Tehran, and with some other disciples of him behind him, because they used to walk behind him and ride behind him. When he would go into the middle of the street, nobody would ever walk with him. They would always walk behind him. Actually, by the way, that is an attitude of a father and son in the Oriental world in those days when I was young. I would never walk with my father on the same level as he was walking. I always had to be a space behind him, slightly. This was an attitude of respect. When the Baha'is used to go and see Shoghi Effendi, they would never stand up with him. They would always stand a step behind him. And when he was talking to them as he was walking along the street in the gardens, as you know, the Persian Baha'is, the Oriental Baha'is used to walk with Shoghi Effendi, and he would walk pace up and down in the gardens with them and talk about various aspects of the faith, asking questions. He had always to turn back and talk with the friend. And no matter how much he would insist, "Please come and walk with me," they could never do that. They would never do that, you see. However, now we go from subject to subject, but when Mirza Abu'l-Fadl went along to this village, the shoe of his donkey fell. You know, the donkeys used to wear the little shoe which you put on the hoof on his feet. It fell, and so they looked for a blacksmith shop to go and fix this shoe. And when he arrived there, this happened to be the blacksmith, who was an illiterate Baha'i, happened to be a Baha'i, and he was illiterate. But he was a wonderful man, and he saw this Mirza Abu'l-Fadl, the famous man, coming to his shop. And so he said, "Now, let me handle this man." He knew that he must teach him the faith. He wanted to say something about the faith. And the first thing he thought was to prolong this operation in order to be able to talk with him. He said, "You know, for all my life I had waited for such a great person to come into my shop. This is the greatest honor that I have been given to me in my life. I am an illiterate man, and now you are such a great person, you have come into my shop. Now let me please ask you 1 or 2 questions, as I'm doing your donkey's foot." And as he was talking to him, he said, "Now I want to ask you a question. You know, in Islam there are so many traditions. Now traditions of Islam is something that, if you're not familiar with it, we will not appreciate what I'm trying to say. There are volumes and volumes and volumes of things which are attributed to the Imams of Islam who have said this. And these have become now, there are so many of them, and so many of them are really kind of things that people have made up things which are all amount to nonsenses. You know, there are a lot of nonsense in them. And there are a few wonderful things, but they're all mixture of nonsense and ridiculous things. They have put down volumes and volumes of them, and this is what the theologians used to study. So he used to go and he said to them, "I want to ask you a question." He said, "Is it true that it is in the traditions of Islam that on every drop of rain which falls, there is an angel sitting down on it, and it brings that rain down? And when the rain comes down, the angel goes up again, sits on another drop of rain, and brings another drop of rain down. Is that true? Is it a tradition of Islam?" He said, "Yes, this is authentic, it's true." He said, "Thank you very much indeed." And he began to carry on and do a little bit more on the shoe. And then after a while he said, "Can I ask you another question?" He said, "Yes." He said, "Is it true that it is one of the traditions of Islam that in a house that there is a dog, no angel will ever go to? because the Muslims actually regard dog as a defiled animal and they don't keep it. And is it true that this is one of the traditions of Islam, that if there is a dog in a house, no angel can go to it? He said, yes, this is true. He said, then how is it that the rain which you said comes has an angel on it, on every one of them, and of course rain fall on the dog and on everything. This was such a brilliant argument that this man had never been defeated in all his life, and he found himself completely and utterly impotent there to answer this man in this question. And he became so impotent and so much taken aback from this illiterate blacksmith. He said, who are you? And somebody whispered in his ears, one of his followers, he said, don't mind him, he's a Babi, he's a Baha'i. And so he said, now this is important. I must find out something. And this fellow, this blacksmith man, did not leave him alone. He went a few days later to the college, and he, although he wouldn't be allowed in, but he nevertheless went in, and he saw Mirza Abu'l-Fadl, and he invited him one night, and he became friends with him. And he invited him one night to his house, and he left the book of servitude on the table, and he went out. And this man, of course, he knew that in such a humble house, a book there, and as soon as you bring a learned person, he immediately goes to the book to take the book. Mirza Abu'l-Fadl says, I took the book, I read it, I became so angry because I rejected everything which was in the book that I read, that I wanted to leave. And then this man came in, he said, I'm sorry, I was away for a while. And he came in, and he began to... and he said, what is wrong, and what is the matter? And he said, he was, what is this book? Anyhow, he said, I can't talk with you, I'll bring somebody who can understand. And he brought one of the learned Baha'is to talk with him about the faith. But this didn't make Mirza Abu'l-Fadl a Baha'i. It took a long time. I cut the long story short. Eventually, this blacksmith, who became so greatly friends with this person, and he used to follow him everywhere he would go into his little room and would help him and serve him. Eventually, one day, he said to him, what are you going to do, Mirza Abu'l-Fadl? You know that it is true. Mirza Abu'l-Fadl, of course, he had a great knowledge and so forth, and this was kind of a barrier for him. He said, and every day, by the way, this blacksmith used to bring into him new tablets, which would have been revealed. He would bring these new tablets to him and say, I can't read it, would you read it for me? And Mirza Abu'l-Fadl, and at that time, a tablet was revealed by Baha'u'llah, in which Baha'u'llah foreshadows the downfall of the Sultan of Turkey. In a very strong language, Baha'u'llah foreshadows the downfall of the Sultan of Turkey, Sultan Abdul Aziz, in which indicated that his days were numbered because of his opposition to the cause of God. And Mirza Abu'l-Fadl closed the book and he said, I'll wait till this happens. And if it happens, I know it is the truth. This man went away, this blacksmith, and he never again went to see Mirza Abu'l-Fadl. For a long, long time, there was a break. He decided to wait. And in those days, all the news, great news, there was no such thing as newspapers, but the news, important news, would be flashed through what they called the telegraph office. And they would print a little sheet. And one morning, the news was printed that the assassination of Sultan Abdul Aziz. As soon as he heard of this, he took one of these papers and rushed to the school, and he was very busy. He said, come, it's very important, I want to see this. He showed him this. Mirza Abu'l-Fadl said, all right, now let me think, let me go, this is true, let me go and I'll say. He said, wait for a minute. He said, wait for a minute. You are going to go from here to that room. He said, yes. He said, how do you know you lived from here to there? It was then that Mirza Abu'l-Fadl prostrated himself there at his feet. And he said, he prayed to God that he never again will allow his knowledge to become a veil between himself and God. And it was there that he acknowledged the faith in that manner. You see, this man, when he became a Baha'i, of course, created such a terrific interest and excitement among people that he was persecuted, and eventually he and so many more Baha'is went into dungeon in Tehran for a number of months, and there is another story, we don't want to go into it. Now, whenever there was anybody attacking the faith, Abdul-Baha would refer them to Mirza Abu'l-Fadl to write an answer to it. And Mirza Abu'l-Fadl was always ready. And the answer that he gave to him is now a book known as the Book of Fara'id, which is the size of Nabil's narrative. Maybe more if it is translated, become much bigger than Nabil's narrative. It is one of the most wonderful books we have in proofs of the faith. It's apart from that book which he wrote called Baha'i Proofs. It's a different thing entirely. It's a different book. He has written several books on various aspects of the faith. But now, what he did in the first chapter of that book, he writes. This is how the Muslim theologians used to deal with one another. You see, he was a master of Arabic, Mirza Abu'l-Fadl, and he finds all the faults which this man has found from the grammar, which this man has committed when he has written this little pamphlet from the grammar point of view. In other words, first chapter of this book is devoted to proving to him that this little pamphlet that you wrote was all of it wrong, most of it wrong from the grammar point of view in the first place. In the second place, he proved that all the things that Baha'u'llah has said is right from the grammar point of view. Then it goes on to the question of the subject matter, which is a vast subject. And when the Shaykh al-Islam received when this book was published, he never again, it is well known that he never again came out into the public to go on the pulpit and teach the faith, because he was completely discredited because of this mighty torrent, you might say, of proofs which Mirza Abu'l-Fadl hit at him. He was wonderfully good in hitting at people with this force of argument, you see. Anyhow, this man, Abdul-Baha, sent to America before Abdul-Baha went to America, because at that time there were only a very few Baha'is in America. The faith was just being introduced into America, and people had very little understanding of the faith. And Mirza Abu'l-Fadl went there, and it was Mirza Abu'l-Fadl who helped the Baha'is so much, because he stayed in that place for so long, and he helped a great deal the deepening of the Baha'is of America at that time. Now, what he did in America and how he used to, he would not allow anybody to help him, to serve him. Never he would allow any time in his life anybody to serve him, because people were in the habit of serving him. And what he would do was this. This was a well-known fact. Abdul-Baha knew this. He was an old man at that time. If you would go to his house, his little room, he would insist that he must make a tea for you. He would serve on you. He would act as a servant, and he would stand up. And many young people, you remember some of you Dr. Muayyad here who came and visited us? Some of you remember him? He used to say to me, he said, I was a young man together with many more. Abdul-Baha sent us, he said, to go to Mirza Abu'l-Fadl's house when he was not well and try to help him, try to make some food for him, and he refused them. He would not allow them. As soon as we went in, he got up from his bed and he said, I must serve you. You see, this is the caliber of man and his humility. I wanted to show you this aspect of him, you see. And this man, when he went to America, Abdul-Baha gave a task to a man known as Ali Quli Khan. Whether you have heard of Ali Quli Khan, who was a well-known Baha'i scholar of the faith again, and he used to translate so many writings into English. Ali Quli Khan, Abdul-Baha particularly sent him to go with Mirza Abu'l-Fadl to help him. And the first thing Mirza Abu'l-Fadl told him was this. He said, if you have come to help me in translating my work in English, you must promise something to me. And that must be a definite promise. And that is this, that I don't want you ever to interfere in my personal life. I don't want you to anything at all, because he knew that this is the first thing that the American believers would do. That they wanted to give things to him and help him, and he would refuse it entirely. And this is some of the things that Baha'is felt so uncomfortable about it when he went there, because they didn't know how to deal with him. And for some time he was completely, they were completely baffled of what to do, because he will not accept any assistance from anybody as far as his person was concerned, you see. So anyhow, this man greatly helped the faith. And when he used to go to, and one of the things he had said in his writings is this. He said, my knowledge is referred to all the time by Baha'is. He said, I always pray that I wish I did not have this knowledge. Because, he said, people are referring to it. And then he gives the description of an ocean and a drop. How a drop of rain can ever count as against an ocean. And he said, Abdul Baha is an ocean. Baha'u'llah is an ocean. Who am I? Why do you always say Mirza Abu'l-Fadl? And he was so much angry with people if they would ever refer to him as anyone who has the knowledge, or they would talk about him. And sometimes he would become so furious that the very face that he was he could become very fierce in his face. He would become so fierce when people would refer to him as a person of importance. This is the aspect that we must remember. This is the essence of humility that you can say. He had this essence of humility. Abdul Baha speaks about it. And you know, this Ali Quli Khan that I was talking to you, this man who went to America to help Mirza Abu'l-Fadl, this great Baha'i scholar who used to translate for him, he has written something, and he says in his writings, Ali Quli Khan says in his writing, he said, I saw only two people in all my life who stand above Mirza Abu'l-Fadl. One is Abdul Baha and the other one is Shawqi Effendi. That is his definition of Mirza Abu'l-Fadl. Now, such a man, when he went to America, he helped the Baha'is so much. When he came to Haifa, years later, some of those very American Baha'is who have been so much assisted by him, one of them was the aunt of Mr. Roberts, and she has said this story. She was one of the early believers, a wonderful Baha'i, and she went to the presence of Abdul Baha when Mirza Abu'l-Fadl was there. And you know how Mirza Abu'l-Fadl used to come into the room of Abdul Baha? He used to always have a stick in his hand, and this stick, which was necessary for him to walk, it was a sign in the Oriental culture. If you have a stick in your hand and walk with it, you will never do that if you are in the presence of a great person. And he always used to put his stick outside the door, and he used to come in the room, and he would not sit in the presence of Abdul Baha. And Abdul Baha would insist and would beg him, and we would say, sit down, Mirza Abu'l-Fadl, and he would sit. And then if ever wanted to ask a question, when all the friends were sitting down and the discussion, any time that Mirza Abu'l-Fadl wanted to ask a question, he would get up, stand up, and bow to Abdul Baha and ask a question. This was his degree of humility, you see. It was a real humility. It wasn't ever, we mustn't think that this was anything to do with somehow being built up or wanted to show. It was inside. This was his feeling, and this was his greatness. And it is because of this. Anyhow, these Americans were there, and they said to the master, when Mirza Abu'l-Fadl was sitting there, and they began to talk about Mirza Abu'l-Fadl, and they said to the master, do you know? Now, Mr. Robert's aunt has said this story. She said, we went there and we began to praise Mirza Abu'l-Fadl's work in front of him to Abdul Baha. We said to Abdul Baha, you know, as a result of the work of Mirza Abu'l-Fadl, all these things have happened in America. Wonderful things have happened. The faith has grown. The Baha'is have become deepened. And Mirza Abu'l-Fadl became so upset that he broke down into tears. And he walked out. And this walking out again in front of Abdul Baha is not something that anybody will do, but he could not stand it. He could not stand it, and he walked out. He walked away. And Abdul Baha turned to these Americans and he said, you know, you have hurt him very much. They said, what have we done? Haven't we praised him enough? Or what has happened? They couldn't understand it. And they said, Abdul Baha then explained to them. He said to them that this man believes that he has done nothing himself. That anything that has been happening is the work of Baha'u'llah. He knows that. And once you attribute this to him, he knows that it is a failure because it is man who is doing this and not God, and because of this he does. You see, this is the sort of thing that I wanted to mention to the friends about the character and qualities of humility. Now we are going to talk about George Townsend sometime tomorrow. Now he was also, to us now, in the Western world, I have not seen people who could really stand up to that humility which he was. He was a humble person. And this is another aspect, which is one of the characteristics of the people who are truly divinely helped and assisted. There are many stories about this, which we can go on and on and on and tell you of humility. But humility is something that we must we attain only when we recognize the manifestation of God. Not until we recognize the manifestation of God can we fully become humble. Humility comes only as a result of this, and nothing else. There is no other way to become absolutely humble unless you recognize the station of the manifestation of God. And when you recognize the station of the manifestation of God, and you become conscious of that, then one feels very inadequate, and one feels then humble. I feel we must strive towards this in a real way by regarding ourselves in relation to the world of reality. And when we regard ourselves in that relation, we will find ourselves very much full of shortcomings. Abdul Baha says, if ever a man sees something in himself which is a little bit good, he must be worried about it then, because he has seen something good in himself, and that's the sign of downfall. And this is very true. We must always aspire to greatness, to go in accordance with the teachings of God. And as you go in accordance with the teachings of God and you grow spiritually more and more, you will find that you will find more things within you which you had not noticed before, which becomes, you will be annoyed as a result of it, you see, because, I'll give you examples of it. I'll just give you some examples of it. For example, supposing there is a boy, a young boy, who has, I remember myself, when I was a young person, I used to go to the college, and when I was in the university in Tehran, I was very, much thinking that I knew an awful lot of things, and none of these people in the room knew about mathematics as much as I did, and I thought this is great if you knew mathematics and physics and all sorts of things, and look at all these people sitting here, they don't know a word about it, you see, and this becomes a kind of this is a growth, this is a maturity. When you learn more about mathematics, and when you come in touch with people more and more, you will find, gosh, you are a tiny little drop. And that is when you realize how insignificant one is when you are confronted with the world of reality. There is a poem in Persian, which is a wonderful poem, and it describes the falling of a drop on an ocean. The falling of a drop of rain on an ocean. And then this drop of rain begins to talk. I say the drop of rain says that there was a drop of rain, and this drop began to come down over an ocean. And then it saw the ocean for the first time. And this drop said to itself, if this exists, who am I? You see? Who am I? And then the more he said this, the closer he became to the ocean. Until the ocean accepted it accepted its humility and made it a part of itself. And then that drop became associated with a pearl in the depth of the ocean. You see? And in its bosom, a pearl was created. And this is, I think, we as drops, and the manifestations of God are as oceans. And that we must, when we look upon ourselves in this light, then we will all become humble. And this is something which we must do more and more, help each other in this way. We must teach, we must read the writings in its right spirit. We must turn to the manifestation of God. And by turning to Him and truly recognizing Him, this will happen. This is an automatic thing which will happen the more we get closer to God. I have never seen in the writings of Shoghi Effendi one word yet, the guardian of the faith, one word in all his life. He never said, I did this. He always referred to himself. Any achievements of the faith, he said, the friends, the believers did this, the believers did that. You see? The only occasion I have seen, which Shoghi Effendi has referred to himself as I, was when he wrote a letter to the United Nations subcommittee in the Palestine thing, and he introduced himself. He said, "I, the guardian of the Baha'i faith," because he's trying to introduce himself. Abdul Baha, when he first came to Europe, when he was freed from prison, when he came to Europe, he did not want to be photographed because he knew that people will make a personality out of him. He did not. He said, "I am a servant. I am a servant." He constantly would say, "I'm a servant." When he used to go to America in these big gatherings and hundreds of people would come to see him, hundreds and thousands would gather in churches and synagogues to hear Abdul Baha, and they would write on posters, "The Prophet of Peace has come." And Abdul Baha would become upset. He said, "Gracious God," these are his own words, "Gracious God, I have always over and over again told these people in these gatherings that I am only a servant of God, and they insist that I'm a prophet." Yes. And then he goes on to say, I remember at one of his talks when he gave in that wonderful synagogue known as the synagogue of Emmanuel in San Francisco. He spoke there to the Jews, a great congregation of the Jews. He proved to them the authenticity of the message of Christ. He proved to them the authenticity of the message of Baha'u'llah. He made them to recognize. It was the most wonderful, illuminating talk. And great numbers of people surged to him. They came forward and they wanted to be blessed by him. And Abdul Baha goes out of this hall eventually, and he turns to those few people who were with him, these few people who accompanied him, and he said to them, "Did you see what happened? Did you see how people were attracted? Did you see how their hearts were became closer to Baha'u'llah? Did you see what manifestations of humility and submissiveness appeared amongst the people? Did you see how they were affected by it?" And then he said, "Do you know why? Because I became selfless. I made myself a channel to Baha'u'llah. Otherwise, who am I?" And he kept on saying this 3 times, "Otherwise, who am I? Otherwise, who am I?" This is all Baha'u'llah who does it. And then he said, if the friends become pure channels and empty themselves of self, they can do the same thing. As we said the other day, a pipe which is connected to the water supply is in itself a black, dirty pipe, nothing else than that, just a black, cold thing. You throw it into the backyard. But once it is connected to the water, if it is emptied, and as long as it is emptied, and to the extent that it is emptied, through that will flow the water of life, and that black and cold pipe becomes a channel through which the forces of the faith flow. And I think this is the function of a Baha'i. We must never think, please friends, whenever we teach the faith, whenever we talk about the faith to people, we must never think that I am going to tell this man about the faith because I know more about it than he does. Look at me, I am a Baha'i, I know much more than he does. Poor fellow, he doesn't know anything about Baha'u'llah, and therefore I am going to now teach him the faith, I'm going to give him this. When my father was in the presence of Baha'u'llah, one of the things he told him was this. He said, when you teach the faith to the people, if you believe in your heart of hearts that you are in any way better than this man that you are teaching, if you feel in your heart of hearts to one extent that you are knowing more than this man does, and if you show the slightest sign in your heart, now I'm not saying in your mouth, in your outward being, but inside you, if you feel any of these things, then your work will be in vain. It will be in vain. And so this must be our attitude. We are not, as Baha'is, are not greater than the people outside us. Really, when you become Baha'is, you realize this. You realize that there are many wonderful people in this town who carry on wonderful works of teaching, wonderful works which are in accordance with the teaching. And all it is that we have recognized Baha'u'llah, we have recognized him, we have been connected to this power station, like I was saying. You see, this lamp in here is connected to the power station. Its light is not from itself, friends. Let us be very clear. The light of this light does not come from itself. If ever this light says, oh, look at me, I've got this light within me, it's finished. It can never become a life. Not until it yields itself, it submits itself to the power station, in the same way that we were talking about, the station, the attitude of the female and the male in relationship to each other. You see that story, that analogy that I was giving, that everything. Now this here acts as a female in relationship to the power station. And as long as it is in that relationship, it becomes illumined. But the minute it thinks that I have light within me, then this is no longer a light. It cannot be a light, you see. Now, this is the same way with us. When we teach the faith, friends, when we come across people, we must not try to think that, I am this, I am that. Because it goes right up against the very spirit of the faith. And we must become a channel. We must tell the people of Baha'u'llah, not because of us, please let us put ourselves out of it. We tell the people of Baha'u'llah because of Baha'u'llah. And because of that, we want people to hear of it. And then we leave them. We leave that person you tell about the faith to Baha'u'llah. Tell him everything he wants. Give him constantly the help he wants. Constantly tell him, constantly teach him. But never think for one moment, I was the cause of this man becoming a Baha'i, This is in itself a failure. Friends, this is going on, and I feel that some of you definitely must go to bed. There's no doubt about it. The question is this, that I have said, it's just a misunderstanding. That you say that as soon as somebody feels that one is good or something like this, or has some good qualities, then that's the time you must stop. You see, what I meant is this. I did not mean that if you have qualities, and every one of us has so many qualities and so many capabilities, that we must say, no, I mustn't do it because it will be bad and that sort of thing. Because, you see, if you are a short-term typist, you are a short-term typist, and therefore this is one of your qualities, you must do it, and you come forward and then you do the work. But all I was saying was that once we try to examine ourselves spiritually and say, how wonderful it is that I am a good person, I have become a good person, that you fail. You see what I mean? And you please yourself and say, look, today, for instance, I gave £1 to a poor man. What a wonderful man I am. This becomes then pride, and this causes the downfall. Now, I tell you something which is interesting. Do you follow what I mean, please? That one must never, of course, concentrate on his shortcomings and say, look, I must always be full of shortcomings so that I can be good. This is the wrong thing. Or if somebody says, look, will you type this sheet of paper? I must never type properly, but I must put something wrong with it. This is amounting to that. See, we must do the best thing we can. But once you do it, you've given your best, that we must not become proud of it. Now, I think I mentioned this once also in the summer school. You know what Abdul-Baha said about the man who says if a man has... Abdul-Baha tries to say that the most important thing in our life is our motive. What is in your heart is the most important thing. Not necessarily what you do, but what is in your heart is the most important thing. I gave you the example, if you want to... There is a man who is sick and you want to really help him, and you go immediately to his help, and then this person dies. You give him a tablet to eat, and that person dies. You have not killed that person. God will reward you as if you have given him life, because your intention, your motive, was to cure him. You see? Abdul-Baha gives another example which is very interesting, and that may answer also some part of your question. He says that supposing there was a man who was poor and he couldn't afford, he was a poor man, and he would say, well, I wish I had a lot of money to go and buy and build a temple for Baha'u'llah, a house of worship for Baha'u'llah. If I had the money, I would build it. And this is in his heart, and he wants to do it. This is his aim in life. And he prays and prays to God. God may give him money because he wants to build a house of worship. Abdul-Baha says it doesn't matter if this man does not get the money. If he's sincere, God will accept him as if he has built a house of worship. And then he goes on to say that supposing this man, God answered his prayers and he got some money and he built a house of worship, he may then, and he builds a house of worship. This may not be so much acceptable to God, perhaps, as the previous case, because it's the danger here that when he builds a house of worship, he may once say, I built it, and that is finished. Everything we do, again, depends on our heart and our motive, and there are moments, of course, there are always moments of ego coming in, and all I can say that man can do and should do, if you ever see this happening, that we must then turn to Baha'u'llah. That's the only way that you can destroy the ego even for a moment and try to replace it. Turn to Baha'u'llah and see yourself as against him, in relation to him. And then when we see ourselves in relation to him, we find very insignificant, and all these things again go back to the original form, perhaps, to that extent that we are able to turn to Baha'u'llah. Turning to Baha'u'llah means, it is a relative term again. Depends how much you turn to him. To that extent that you turn to him more and more and more, to that extent you become able to get rid of this life. We must not think again that one saying now will destroy it, and then that's that. All I meant, it's an attitude which will grow up. We must not allow these momentary things, which sometimes may be days, sometimes may be months, to become a big thing and becomes eventually a part of us. This is what I'm trying to say. Otherwise, of course, man is always confronted with this cross-current of conflict within him. The ego comes up. The ego wants to destroy yourself, because remember, the greatest enemy we have is within us. It's not outside us. The greatest enemy we have is within us, and that's the ego. Now that is always trying to, well, now we must be always aware of it. But, and its moments, always there are these moments which come and go. But we must not ever allow that ego to become consolidated all the time, and eventually becomes a part of us. You see what I mean again? And the very effort that we make to destroy that ego, that very effort in itself is very good. It's a sign that we are overcoming it.